Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 26, Engagement and Job Satisfaction. All right, recall in lecture 25 was the start of chapter 9, and we talked about motivation, and specifically we talked about how does IO psychology define motivation and what are some of the frameworks or theories behind it. So we talked about what is motivation and what do we specifically mean by motivation at work. We talked about content theories of work motivation and process theories of work motivation. Today we'll finish chapter 9. Chapter 9 is only, 22 pages or so. The last lecture was short. This lecture will also likely be short. Either way, it's going to be pretty straightforward. And we're going to talk about engagement, and which is a broader term that would include job satisfaction. So what do we mean by engagement? And then how do we measure job satisfaction? Some things to think about regarding engagement, job satisfaction, stress, and other things around what happens when you lose your job. Talk about the connection between job satisfaction and behavior, between job satisfaction and compensation. We'll talk about this thing called job involvement, and we'll talk about organizational commitment and organizational citizenship. All right, let's get into it. What is engagement? Really, engaged employees are those that are energized by the job. They can get engrossed in the tasks, and they're committed to the organization. There's three aspects that could be associated with high engagement. There's a certain vigor in the performance of the work. There's a dedication to the work, and there's an absorption in the work. The engagement is itself a positive experience. It's usually associated with openness to learning. And then engagement broadly would include job satisfaction, but engagement would be broader in its dimensions. Now, here's the part. You won't hear engagement much in the literature of biopsychology. It's a corporate word, more so, although it's used extensively right now in corporate America as a broader term. Instead of trying to make people satisfied, we want people engaged, and it's more of an outcome-based perspective, I guess. And again, remember, the stuff that's on the test is the stuff that's in my slides and in the book. If I'm talking about stuff that you don't find in the book, it won't be on the test. All right, so job satisfaction is really about what are the positive, and it includes being dissatisfied, so it's a measure. So it includes the positive and negative thoughts, your feelings, your attitudes towards your job. It can be influenced by personal factors. It can be influenced by things that happen at work, and it includes your sense of fulfillment. Where engagement is a popular target right now for corporate employment surveys, and I'm calling this lecture engagement, basically to help socialize with you that concept. Although for the most part, the book would consider the relevant parts job satisfaction. Okay, how do you go about measuring job satisfaction? Well, surveys. You ask people, how satisfied are you in various ways. There's this thing called the Job Description Index. That looks at how do you feel about your pay? Do you think you are being treated fairly with regards to promotion opportunities? Do you have promotion opportunities? How are you feeling about how you're supervised? How do you feel about the work itself? How do you feel about your coworkers? There's a thing called the Minnesota Satisfaction Questionnaire. So these things where you see an initialism associated, like JDI or MSQ, these are IO psychology terms. Some of them have gotten traction with HR, and you might find them in various organizations. Some of them might be dated. Some of them might be used only within literature. The MSQ, or the Minnesota Satisfaction Questionnaire, that looks at 20 different facets of the job, and those things include like how much autonomy you have, how independent are you, how well are you recognized, what are your working conditions, in an assorted number of things. And then there's things like polling. Okay, so Gallup had a poll on job satisfaction that found that, only 10 to 13% of people said they were dissatisfied with their jobs. Well, that's kind of one of those how you frame the question, because that doesn't necessarily mean that almost 90% of people would say they were satisfied, because those aren't. If you ask somebody, are you dissatisfied with your job, that's not the exact counterpoint to are you satisfied, because you can be not satisfied and not dissatisfied at the same time. So I don't know how much utility there is in something like a simple poll like that. So then various job satisfaction measures have found differences across a lot of things. So age and race, experience level, intelligence, skills, a number of other things that when you sort, if you get a big enough subject pool and you sort according to these characteristics, you can find the differences in job satisfaction, which is just to say that you can find differences in job satisfaction if you get it over people of different age groups, for instance. Each one of these dimensions is bringing different experiences. I mean, somebody at a different age has had, somebody a lot older has experienced a lot more change in their workplace, and that might be good or bad. Anyway, there's not a whole lot of profundity that comes from this. Just understand that job satisfaction is multidimensional, and the person is every bit or more the factor, and the person's multidimensional complexity as opposed to the job. And this should make sense. I mean, you can have a job and have 10 people in the job and have 10 different levels of job satisfaction that are all contextual to the person. What does the person like to do? What is the person's past experience? What is the person's level of need for this job? What are these person's alternatives? So, I mean, it's really a subjective thing, job satisfaction. What makes you happy, what makes you fulfilled. Naturally, this would be highly variable. So it's you don't craft, a job that no matter who you put in it, people will be satisfied. That doesn't mean that you don't look at this and try to figure out how can you get the most people to be the most satisfied, so that they stay, they become highly engaged, they give their full efforts to the job, they speak highly of it to their coworkers and friends, and those sorts of things. But it's impossible, to make a job that every single human being will be satisfied with. And there are probably human beings that no matter what you do aren't going to be satisfied in a job that you give them, and you're really looking for the big people, the big chunk of ways you have options of crafting a job, and the large group of people in the middle that are variable, that can be satisfied given the right match. So anyway, let's talk about losing your job and its effect. So for many people, when they lose a job, it's akin to a feeling of personal betrayal. You felt committed, depending upon the circumstance. Some people lose their job and it's because they hated their job and they hated their boss and they acted accordingly. But for people that lose their job in the sense that they didn't want to lose their job, it's often quite a blow, and it can be a major stressor, such that if you lose your job and you're over 50, it doubles your chance of heart attacks and strokes. There's a term, kubikiri, in Japanese that relates to losing your job, and it is basically a metaphor for beheading. Now, you can not lose your job and still experience a lot of stress and possibly a sense of betrayal, and certainly a reduction in how committed you are to the organization. And that's when you see your coworkers lose their job, especially if they're coworkers. If you felt that, if it's one thing people have coworkers that everybody, wishes were not there, that they're just, they can't do their job, or they're just super negative. They might be actually doing so many counterproductive work behaviors that it is a major dissatisfier for you and everybody else to be around that person. In which case, there are times in which your coworker can lose your job where people will applaud. But when it comes in the form of like layoffs, or if it's not understood as to why a person lost their job, it can have a pretty significant effect on the people that are still there. So in the wake of like large job cuts, often you can get this sort of survivor mentality of the people that are left, and that's not, it's certainly not positive, and it can be a long time to rebuild somebody's loyalty towards an organization if there were a lot of cuts that even if you survived them. And so this notion of the prospect. So if there were a bunch of cuts and you survived them, you still have this sense of uncertainty. Well, maybe it could be me next. And so this prospect of losing your job, like hanging over your head at varying levels of probability in your mind, that's itself a very stressful thing. And sometimes organizations do restructuring, and they do a wave of cuts, and then they hope that's enough. They hope they've shored up their bottom line, and that the market responds, or Wall Street responds favorably, or whatever. But then another few months go by, and they keep losing money or whatever, and they have to do more cuts. Sometimes that uncertainty can last for months or even years in an organization, and that it can be quite a chronic stressor. And then once these things settle out and it looks like the organization's on sound footing and is not doing any layoffs, it can be years and years to get back to the sort of feeling of mutual commitment that might have been present beforehand. I mean, and generally speaking, if you lose your job for performance reasons, that can be more traumatic than losing it for reasons outside your control. I mean, if you basically are told, you're terrible at your job, so much so that you're irredeemable to us, it's going to cost us too much to try to train you to be better, or we don't even think you'll ever figure out how to do your job, so I'm sorry, but you're fired. That has its own impact on you and your self-narrative, versus, hey, company's losing all sorts of money, we really can't afford our current structure, and we're going to be getting rid of all sorts of things, including the whole department that you're in, and everybody's out of work, sorry. Generally speaking, the first one, performance, can be more traumatic, but not always. Not always. It really depends upon what your circumstances are. There could be times when you're so financially dependent upon your job, where if you're fired for performance, it could be something that it's just something unique. You didn't get along with your boss at all, and your boss's opinion of your performance was such that you were fired, but the real situation, and you don't feel personally to blame for it, and you can defend your self-narrative, and if you do that, make sure you're doing it as honestly as you can, and not just trying to protect yourself to avoid having to deal with something that might be a gap. But anyway, there could be circumstances where you were fired, but you might think it's an injustice, but it didn't actually affect your sense of yourself, and you could be then the only one let out of work, and you could more easily get another job. Whereas if your whole department or your whole factory was put out of work, you can find yourself competing for local jobs with your former coworkers. And so your prospect of getting a job in the wake of a large-scale local layoff, it can be harder than just singularly losing your job. So the devil's in the details on those, in terms of whether they're which one is harder and which one's more stressful. Either way, losing one's livelihood can be hard, regardless of the cause. All right, let's look at job satisfaction and behavior. So, generally speaking, if you have high job satisfaction, that tends to increase the pro-social behaviors that you have towards others. I mean, you're happy in your job. You're happy with who you're at. You've got a sense of purpose, meaning, fulfillment. And you carry yourself in a certain way with your group interactions, and it tends to manifest as pro-social behaviors, and those things tend to help with group cohesion, and group cohesion itself tends to feed pro-social behaviors. So these things are a reciprocal loop, and so you get these virtuous cycles that come from job satisfaction. So a good work environment tends to create a good work environment. And of course, the opposite is also true. A bad work environment can create job dissatisfaction. Job dissatisfaction can create a bad work environment. It's also linked to higher productivity. And likewise, the opposite is also true of people that are disengaged. That tends to be very costly to an organization. It's also linked to higher job satisfaction, understandably is linked to people less likely to not show up and also more likely to stay in the organization. And if you're satisfied in your job, I mean, leaving the organization actually represents a loss. So, I mean, if you're satisfied in your job, and even if you have another opportunity that is more pay or more whatever, it's not an automatic if you're satisfied with your job, because you still have to give that up. And then dissatisfaction, I mean, that is linked to counterproductive work behaviors. It's linked to just withdrawal or disengagement. It also tends to be different across ages. It's less prevalent to workers under 30. I guess a way to look at that is if you have somebody that's in their 40s or 50s and they're becoming job dissatisfied, they've kind of been there, done that. They've kind of seen it. They've kind of seen if they feel like their efforts are futile, they feel less guilty about basically shirking their responsibilities and just sitting around and gossiping with other people or cruising the internet instead of working, because they really feel like anything else they might do that could be work related wouldn't matter anyway. Whereas people that have less experience might have more inherent optimism. And if they're dissatisfied, they might still keep cranking along a little bit more. Certainly not universal, but I mean this is something that's been seen, that there are some differences in how much counterproductive work behavior people engage in when they're dissatisfied based on age. Jobs that have this is sort of getting into the nature of the job. If it allows for creativity, if it allows for challenge, if there's a healthy amount of complexity and not too much. Everybody's a little different in how much they want, and if there's a good amount of autonomy, the combination of those things tend to drive job satisfaction and can tend to drive retention. I mean, people generally, they're happier, they're more satisfied if they feel that they have opportunities to grow, if they have opportunities to stretch and do it in a way that they can feel validated that it was their work. That's why the autonomy part is important, that it was real non-trivial work. That's where the challenge and the complexity comes from. All right, let's talk about satisfaction and compensation. We talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture, that income and happiness, they're linked only to a point. Once your basic needs are met, that curve tends to bend and the link becomes less strong. So money can pay for the things that would otherwise stress you if you couldn't pay for them. So money can take away a number of definite stressors, but once those stressors are paid for, basically, because you're making enough money, the other things that you sort of carry with you that part of your own self-narrative that may or may not lead to you being happy, money doesn't tend to help with that. So these things are complicated. If you have a perceived imbalance, if you think that that your pay is unjust, that can lead to grievance. If you perceive that things are fair, if you feel like that there's justice in your workplace, that can lend itself to being more satisfied. This should be common sense. This would go right into the previous lecture where we talked about equity theory with J. Stacey Adams. So if you're being paid fairly, compared to others, sometimes that can matter more than the amount. I mean, within reason. I'd asked in the previous lecture, what would you prefer? A 10% raise, but you're the lowest paid in your group, or a 5% raise and you're the highest paid. People react to that differently over time. Being satisfied with your pay, it is linked to better performance. And there's things called merit pay systems where that deliberately link pay for performance. And those are often baked into a performance appraisal or a performance management system. You can have wage incentive structures if you have work that's measurable. Not all work is easily quantifiable. Some factory type work can can tie like what your output is, how fast can you do assembly stuff, and then at the same time quality. You know, how can you make the fewest mistakes? So how quickly can you produce stuff with the least amount of mistakes? And there are some roles where that can be properly measured, and there are some organizations that attach incentive compensation so that you can get paid more and more the sort of faster you can make high quality product. It's more common in a wage structure. It's more difficult in salaried type roles, or a little bit harder to quantifiably and fairly measure those things. But it's debated as to whether that really does drive the appropriate long-term behavior. All right, let's talk about this thing called job involvement. And it's really, to what extent do you psychologically identify with your job? The I am an versus I work at. So I am an engineer versus I work at Acme Engineering. And the I am part is a sort of a self-identity. And if you have a lot of job involvement, I am a nurse. That is who I am. It isn't I work in this healthcare facility and I perform nursing responsibilities and my job title is, nurse. That's a different thing than I am a nurse. This kind of gets to this, career versus job thing. But to what extent is your self-narrative? To what extent is your sense of identity, wrapped up in your job? And if it's really wrapped up, then you have high job involvement. We're going to talk about organizational commitment, and these things overlap in this spot, which is sometimes the I work at can be a strong sense of identity, but not with the job, but more with the organization. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. It's a strong cultural element to this. We have, for better or for worse, we're in an organization that how do I say this, because I don't actually agree with it. I think it's fair to say, culturally we attach status to attorneys at a higher level than we attach to sanitation workers. Which would you rather eliminate half of? Would the world be a better place if half of the attorneys all went and found other jobs? Or half of the sanitation workers went and found other jobs? Which ones are actually more? We found out in COVID, this notion of essential worker, and we had a cultural moment there. At least a number of us did, where there was a renewed sense of appreciation for people that work with their hands, their bodies, that stand in their feet, perform service work, make your burrito. But yet. We have all these prestige hierarchies and status hierarchies, and then we have market forces of supply and demand, and the net effect of that is there's a cultural identity. There's a cultural element to this identity, for better or for worse. So somebody that's a lawyer is more likely, I would say, to say I'm a lawyer. Than if somebody is a sanitation worker to say, I am a sanitation worker in the same context. I would tell you that I have a lot of friends that are lawyers, but we need, society needs all of our sanitation workers, and we ought to hold them in higher esteem, because that is a non-trivial job in terms of challenge and difficulty and working conditions. But nonetheless, there are cultural factors involved in these things, and whether somebody personally has a strong identity with themselves and the job. Hopefully this makes sense. So this gets, in the West and in America in particular, this is pretty strong. Hence we often ask people, what do you do when you're meeting people at a cocktail party, if people even have those anymore, but some sort of event where you're meeting a bunch of new people. It's often to say, it's quite common to say, what do you do, as opposed to like, what is your family? What's your family sigil? What's the tell me the story of your people, so to speak. We tend to be individualistic, and it tends to be wrapped up in jobs. So this job identity, high job involvement, it is linked to job satisfaction, whereas poor identification, where you just don't really feel like your job is you. I mean, sometimes that can impede performance. It can impede your growth trajectory, especially when it can become self-fulfilling. Like if you're starting to explicitly look at your job and start thinking things like, this isn't who I am. That's different from you can be in a job and not like have it be your identity, but without going all the way to this isn't who I am. That's kind of a rejection. It's like I'm avoidant to this job. I don't want to be here. I don't want anybody to think that this is me. And you'll see this. I mean, you'll see this whole "this isn't who I am" when you're getting your burrito. You'll when you're in a fast casual service organization and people are making food in front of you, you can tell where somebody is like, this job might not be me, but hey, it's okay. It's what I got to do, and I'm interacting with another human being. I'm being respectful and mutually respectful, and I've got a job to do, and I'm going to do it, and make your burrito. And it's a good experience, and you can see that they're putting care into it. And it doesn't mean that they have to be like, this is who I am. I am a burrito artist. It can really just, I'm somebody that, takes some pride in my work. But then you'll get somebody that you can just tell they're like, this isn't who I am. This isn't who I am. And it ends up being sort of performative. They like have to tell you in an embodied way that this isn't who they who they are, with a kind of okay, what do you want? Would you like beans? What kind of meat? And you can just kind of see them kind of going through the motions. I hate this job. This isn't who I am. I'm better than this. Don't be that person. And not just for the experience. I mean, you've all been through it, right? Where you can tell when someone's in a service role, and you can just tell they're just, this isn't who I am, and they're just unhappy. That negative effect that has on you and your sort of satisfaction with the experience, but that's not why you shouldn't. That's not the only reason, and it's barely the main reason. The real reason you shouldn't do that is the negative effect that has on you if you're that employee. If you go all the way to this isn't who I am, and yet you have to stay, if you can't quit because you need the job, and it might take you a long time to figure out another alternative, depending on what your optionality is. If you go to the this who isn't who I am kind of an avoidant thing, that's its own reciprocally causal thing. That's its own self-fulfilling prophecy of negativity. You'll be negative. Your experience will be unpleasant. Your coworkers' experiences of you will be unpleasant. Your customers' experiences of you will be unpleasant. You're not going to be treated in a way that's as pro-social as you would be if you weren't so negative. You're not going to be given opportunities when you're trying to find another job, and if you sort of let it out, like, oh yeah, right now I work at the burrito place and it sucks, it's all in your, that whole thing, energies in your countenance. You're less likely to actually get the next job. Whereas if you just accept, okay, I have to have this job, until it doesn't pay well, and I could barely make my rent, and my car just broke down, and it's $2,000 to fix it. Now I'm having to get a ride. It sucks. Life sucks. Well, here I am at my job. I don't want to make it even more miserable by wallowing in my own misery. I'm going to actually at least take some pride in the dignity of work. I got a burrito to make, and hell, I'm going to make a good burrito for this person, because I don't want to be somebody that wallows in my own self-pity or whatever. I'm kind of on a coaching tangent here, but this is really important stuff that I would suggest that you look at this in your life, and look at people that are manifesting the two versions of this. One is just embrace a certain dignity in all work, versus people that are this isn't who I am, and think about how both of them have a certain type of self-fulfillment to them. All right, so just working with teams, and gaining experience working in teams, those things help with identity. I mean, you might have a job that initially you're like, whatever, this isn't very fun and it's kind of boring or whatever. But months go by and you develop bonds with the team and you develop some experience, then you start to have a little bit of mastery in whatever it is. All those things can actually have it if you have the right attitude. If you don't do this isn't who I am, and you don't wallow in how much it sucks, you can actually increase over time the job involvement. And don't be afraid, to have at least some semblance of an identity associated with making a good burrito. It'll help you in life if you try to find the positive in as many things you can associated with work, and just having good coworkers, and recognize that if you have good coworkers, you probably had a part to play in that, and recognize that if you have a bunch of shitty coworkers, you probably had a part to play in that. So behave accordingly, because how you behave affects the outcomes that you have to live with. Okay, organizational commitment. So this is sort of the other part of identity. So this is more of to what extent you identify with the organization you're part of, whether the job is great or not. But you might associate with where you work. So this is psychological identification, or attachment to the organization or lack thereof. This is the I work at. There's a famous thing with Steve Jobs, the former CEO. He died some time ago, but he was the super famous CEO of Apple. And early on in Apple's organization, when Apple was growing and they needed an experienced CEO, he recruited an executive from Pepsi. And he said something along the lines of, "Hey, do you want to sell sugar water, or do you want to change the world?" And that was Steve Jobs was famous for that whole changing your sense of reality, and they called the reality distortion field. But certain organizations, and I would say that it's ebbed and flowed over the years, but currently right now working at Apple has some pretty good inherent brand associations. And if you work at Apple, and if you like that brand, being able to say I work at Apple can have a strong psychological impact on you. It can be very positive. So this is an in-group association thing, as opposed to a job identification is a little bit more of a self-narrative thing. It's more of a niche thing. This is my role, whereas I work at is more of I'm part of this in-group, and if that in-group is something that you associate within your value structure, it's culturally viewed as a prestige or status hierarchy, or being higher than other organizations, that can be a big part of job satisfaction. If you work at a place people want to work at. And the other side of it, you can have a really great job, but you work at a company that you feel is kind of shitty, or maybe culturally isn't looked upon very well. Maybe its brand is diminished, it's gotten in trouble in the news, or it's associated with products that people don't like, or whatever. That can actually hurt your job satisfaction, because you're not part of a winning team, or the larger in-group that you identify with in your culture, looks upon your sub-in-group of your company in a negative sort of way, and then you're like, I don't want to be associated with this. The organizations that have a really strong brand, I mentioned Apple, Tesla, there's a number of companies that just have, like, the market leaders are often associated with higher levels of status, and so there's often stronger organizational commitment, and all those things then create positive feedback loops. So the companies that do the best and to build the biggest brands, they can attract the best talent often because they have the most profit, and so that they can pay for the most talent, and then the talent is also likes the fact they're associated with the biggest brand. That actually helps the organization be better, and can snowball positively. And that's where you end up with like really, really successful organizations, because however you slice this organization to look at it dimensionally, you see all these positive reinforcing feedback loops, and then the other part of it can happen. Companies can spiral down just because their brand isn't what it used to be. They've lost their market presence. They maybe did some stupid stuff in the market. Maybe people start associating them with bad practices, and then some of the high talent is like, I don't want to be associated with this. I'm losing my organizational commitment, and they start to leave. And then you have a sort of a diluting of talent, and then people see the talent leaving, and that makes some of the other talent leaving, and before you know it, you've lost a lot of your best people, and then you're now sort of mediocre in terms of performance level, and you're also losing market share, and now you're not performing the way you used to, and you can't reset yourself, and then you can go on a long death spiral. So, and everything in between. Organizational commitment is an interesting concept, and you definitely see it at work. And if you can choose between two companies and you don't know anything about the jobs, you don't know anything different about the jobs, except for this one is like associated with a company that you think you'd like to work at, and this one doesn't have anything associated with it. You don't really know what this company is, or nobody understands it. And all other things being equal, you might have more satisfaction with the one that you have better in-group associations with, because you'll get more organizational commitment. That's not to say that the other choice might not have actually had better opportunities for you. Might not have been a better job. That's why I said all other things being equal. All right, so this is also about to what extent do you accept the organization's values and goals. This comes with in-group association. Part of being an in-group is a binding narrative. It's sharing the same frameworks. It's sharing the same narrative that says who we are and what we do and what we value, and the extent to which you incorporate that, you inculcate that in terms of the organization's value, its value structure, its goals, its mission, its binding narrative. High organizational commitment comes with a lot of acceptance of that, and so you get a strong desire to stay affiliated with this company, and if something doesn't interrupt that, that can increase with time. And it's usually tied with sort of a perceived reciprocity. Like the more committed you are to the organization, you perceive that the organization is really committed to you. And if all of a sudden, after years of working, this organization that you have an immense organizational commitment for suddenly lays off 10% of its workforce, that's why that whole betrayal thing comes in. That's where I was 100% committed to this, and I really thought that this commitment was bidirectional, and all of a sudden, two of my best friends at work just got laid off, and I'm worried about my own job. Who is this company? I don't know who you are anymore. It's kind of like it's not that different from a marriage that where there was some sort of betrayal, and your spouse, who you were with for many years, you thought you knew, and all of a sudden they did something that you just don't understand. I mean, it doesn't have to be an affair. It can be all sorts of things. That is just a behavior that seems antithetical to your shared values and binding narrative, and it's like, I don't know who you are anymore. The same thing can happen at work. Now, keep in mind that an organization that suddenly has to lay off 10% of its people because they want to do some sort of market pivot or make Wall Street happy or whatever, you could also have quit at any time. And so make sure you're being fair in how you feel about a company, and prepare yourself for these things. Anyway, hopefully this is making sense. The factors related to this include things that tend to make you more committed to the organization is good autonomy, an enriched experience, being able to actually have mastery and apply it, and associating your team that you work with positively. That whole positive feelings, those are effective. They're attitudinal, but there's also other things that can make you increase your organizational commitment. So there's continuance or what's called behavioral elements, and that's things like, hey, you got a great pension. There's just fantastic things associated with this. Or the longer you work there, the higher seniority you have, and that brings with it a bunch of perks. That doesn't necessarily mean that the brand that you work for is super positive, but there might be things that make you more committed over time, just because of what is present in as part of the job. And then there's this normative commitment, and that's if the company hasn't done anything, to deliberately make you want to leave. Sometimes there's a sense of obligation. So you can look at those as three things: affective, behavioral, and normative. Affective is sort of the first several bullets, and behavioral is peripheral things that cause you to behave in a committed way, and normative is just sort of to what extent do you feel it's appropriate to dance with the one that brought you, so to speak. All right, let's talk about organizational citizenship. And that is, remember we talked about counterproductive work behaviors, and then we also talked about organizational citizenship. So this is to what extent are you doing things that help the organization outside of your task, and having high engagement and going the extra mile, taking on additional responsibilities, taking on additional assignments, volunteering for things, helping others, following the rules when no one's looking, promoting the organization, protecting the organization, always keeping a positive attitude no matter what comes. All of those sort of things can be looked at as organizational citizenship. It can be hard to define, but you know it when you're doing it, and you often know it when you see it. All right. I said it would be a short lecture, 41 minutes. So that wraps up the chapter. We'll have a bonus lecture next. So today we talked about engagement and finished up chapter 9. We talked about what is it with regard to what's in the book and what largely is going to be associated with the test. It'll be the things that are in chapter 9 that are also in this lecture, and that's more involved, more things like job satisfaction and job involvement and that sort of thing. So we talked about how you measure job satisfaction. We talked about the impact of losing your job. We talked about the overlap between behavior and satisfaction. We talked about satisfaction and compensation. We talked about job involvement, and that's sort of your sense of identity, your self-narrative wrapped up in your job or not. We talked about organizational commitment, the sense of in-group identity that you do or do not have with the organization that you work for. And we talked about organizational citizenship. Okay, next chapter, chapter 27, a bonus lecture, we're going to talk about something really hard, becoming more motivated. And there isn't any secret sauce on this. It is a long journey, and I'll give you my slice on it for what it's worth. Hopefully it'll have some value. I'm going to talk about knowing yourself. I'm going to talk about negotiating with yourself. I'm going to talk about hacking yourself, and I'm going to talk about transforming yourself. Okay, I hope there were some interesting points finishing up chapter 9, and we will see you for lecture 27.